Let's go ahead and turn over to Habakkuk chapter 3. Chapter 3. We're going to conclude this morning in this chapter with this series. And I hope that it's been beneficial. I pray that we learn from this what is necessary to encourage us as we sojourn here on this earth as God's children. It's important for us, and we never know where the winds of politics or famine or war will take us. You never know what's going to show up. It's never... we live in a world that's always changing. You never get comfortable in it because you never know what's going to happen. I'm reading this book right now, Glory and Hope, I believe it's called. Glory and Hope. Tragedy and Hope, thank you. It's like this big. Rakeem bought it for me through his mother. And it's the downfall of Western civilization. And the author of the book talks about how civilizations rise and fall and what leads to and every one of them follows the same pattern. It's an interesting book, and it's eye-opening when you begin to look at stuff and you're like, that's interesting. One thing that he doesn't focus too much on is the working of God within all that. Right? He does mention a few things here and there, but it's not a religious book, it's a historical book. It's on history of nations. And we're looking at what God does with nations, how he uses them for his purpose. I think each one of us at some time in our life have been told to do something that we didn't quite understand the necessity of doing it. But as time went on, we may have begun to get a clearer picture of why we were told to do this. That happens at times with your children, right? You teach them certain things and they just don't understand why they need to do that. And then years later, they're thanking you for teaching them that because they actually see the reason why you were teaching them that. Going back and looking at the lessons from Habakkuk, he's in a very similar situation. He can't understand in chapter 1 why the evil that is taking place in Judah has gone unchecked, why God hasn't answered his prayer and dealt with it. But we know that God responds to him and tells him that he is dealing with it, and he's dealing with it in a way that is very unconventional, that Habakkuk wouldn't believe, that he was going to bring up the Chaldeans to take care of the problem. In the second complaint of Habakkuk, he begins to complain about how God is dealing with it then. Okay, so you're dealing with it, but how can you use such an evil nation to bring down a people that are more righteous than they? Habakkuk seems to think that is contrary to the nature of God. But God responds by telling him that even though he's going to use the Chaldeans to punish Judah for their wickedness, it doesn't mean that the Chaldeans are going to escape punishment themselves. And that is not contrary to his nature to use this to deal with evil. And because of this, he reminds Habakkuk that Habakkuk just simply needs to sit back and be quiet. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. God is doing his work. And we may not always understand how he's doing his work. And it may be confusing to us. But he's doing his work. He hasn't stopped. And we don't always get to see what's going on. Ours is simply to do the work that he's left us to do while he does the work that he needs to do. Ultimately, what we're going to see in the conclusion of Habakkuk is that God is doing what he's doing to protect his people. He's doing what he's doing because he loves those who are faithful to him. And he needs to preserve them. He needs to preserve Judah because the Christ is going to come through that remnant. So he, in doing what he does, is going to prevent the wicked people of Judah, those Jews who no longer believe, who are no longer accepting him. He has to remove them out of the picture. Because a little leaven leavens a whole lump. If he doesn't remove the unbelieving Jews from those who want to stay true, then they too face the possibility of this apostasy, falling away as well. And so he's going to use the Chaldeans to do this. Now, I want you to stop and think about this for a second. Keep this in mind when you try to compare this to modern day situations. The Chaldeans are not the problem. They're just the tool. The problem is Judah. Israel's already been taken off into captivity. Judah is the problem now because they're beginning to go down that path that Israel did. They're beginning to act in ways that are completely against God. So he is going to use these evil people, the Chaldeans, to bring about punishment of his own people, or those who would claim to be his people, so that he can save those who actually are his people. I think the scenario that some see today, they look at America and they try to figure this out. How does this apply to America and the church and so forth today? Well, I would suggest that if we're following the same train of thought that is taking place in Habakkuk, America would be the Chaldeans. The split, the punishment that God would bring would be upon those churches out there who were once members of his body who have begun to go away from his will. And in doing so, they've begun to lead faithful members of his body along with them. So if we're going to compare it straight across, it would be those churches of Christ that have begun to take on denominational practices and worship. They're the ones who have begun to forsake God. And in the process, we see them leading faithful members along with them. So to preserve the body, then what would happen? How would God save his people from that happening? Now, I'm not saying that is what's happening. I'm not. I'm just saying if we're going to compare it, that's what it would look like. Because I think what happens is too many people look at America and they see America as Judah and then some other entity as the Chaldeans. America's not Judah. America's not the covenant people of God. We're not. Christians are the covenant people of God, and we happen to live in America. And we are a minuscule part of this country. The vast majority of this country are ungodly people. They live without God in their lives. And I'm not just talking about atheists. I'm talking about denominationalists. I'm talking about these entities that claim Christ as their head, but all they do is lead people away from God. There is no good in that. God never looked favorably upon some people that were kind of teaching his way while leading his people away. He said, well, at least you're doing some good. We are a kingdom within a kingdom. We are a minuscule part of this. We need to remember that. So that when and if something happens, we remember our place in all of this. Because that's our hope. That's what eventually for Habakkuk gives him some peace. Is because he knows that God is going to save his people even when he's bringing down the wickedness of another nation, or even of those who were once his people. So as we close out Habakkuk, we finally see an awakening on his part. God's nature of mercy and wrath is evident. He's going to save his people, but he will also punish the wicked. So let's look at this last part of Habakkuk, the prayer, point 1, the prayer for intervention in verses 1 and 2. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth, Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk has a stark realization that God is bringing upon Judah a horrifying event. In fact, when you take a look at this word here, Shigionoth, it depicts a conflicting emotion. There's one of hope, but there's one of dread. On one hand, he understands that God is going to deal with the problem, but on the other hand, he is in dread because he knows how horrible it's going to get to deal with the problem. Sometimes the wickedness has gotten so bad, as we see with Judah, it takes a more violent, wicked nation to bring them down. Our country has gotten really bad. Really bad. The things that are accepted and promoted as being just fine that fly in the face of God every day. These so-called churches out there who begin to promote sin. They weren't God's people anyway, but by the fact that they claim to be God's people and promote sin, how bad is it getting when you have churches promoting as perfectly fine the homosexual lifestyle, when God clearly speaks against it? No question, no confusion. How bad does it have to get that even these people who claim to be God's children are allowing the world that they live in to affect them? So Habakkuk understands how bad it's gotten. His prayer began that way. And he wants God to deal with it. And God says, look, this is how bad it is. I'm going to bring a nation up against it. And Habakkuk sees that nation as being more evil than the people he's praying for or against. And so he's emotionally struggling. His prayer is offered because he sees this horrible event that's unfolding before him. It's almost like a violent set of emotions he's having. I mean, it's as if you're sitting someplace and you know that in the end things will be okay, but in the meanwhile, it's going to be really bad. And you don't like that. You know, there's so much uncertainty. There's so much concern, so much fear. He has this sense of uncertainty. With this in mind, he then turns to God in an emotional plea in verse 2. Lord, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk appeals to the highest authority, the Lord, the I am. He's appealing to him, to his nature. He's appealing to his mercy. I know what you're going to do. I know how bad it's going to get. But remember, have mercy on those who aren't like the ones that bring about this wrath. It's almost like a childlike, humble adoration in trust. He pleads with God, please remember mercy. He's not saying, please stop it. He didn't ask for him to stop it. In fact, what he says is, do it quickly. He says over here in verse 2, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. He's saying, do it quickly, do it now, get it done, get it over with, but be merciful when you do it. So Habakkuk no longer doubts that God is dealing with the problem. He is firmly assured that he's going to work on it. He has been working on it. He's going to continue to work on it. But he knows that the coming of the Chaldeans and their subsequent downfall will be a great time of upheaval in their life. And he's requesting God not to forget mercy upon his people. And he once again appeals to the nature of God, that idea of mercy. Go back to Exodus with me. Chapter 34. He's and that's often what the writers will do. They'll appeal to the nature of God, knowing that, yes, he is a God of wrath, but he's also a God of mercy. He's a God of compassion. He's a God of love. In Exodus 34, down in verses 6 and 7. 34, 6 and 7. Then the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. You see, you have the nature of God being proclaimed there. You have God who is a merciful God, a loving God, a caring God, a forgiving God. But you also have a God of wrath, one who will not allow sin, iniquity to go unpunished. And Habakkuk knows that, and he's appealing to God, in the face of your wrath, mercy. Remember mercy. Habakkuk has received an answer to his prayers, although it's not what he hoped for. It's what God has planned, and he has to simply accept it. And that'll be no different for us, whatever may happen in whatever country we live in. Massive empires have come and gone in this world before. I don't know why we would assume that America is meant to last. Why? Doesn't take much for a country to fall. So if in fact something were to happen, what would be our role in it as Christians? What would be our responsibility? Would you allow the decay of the nation you live in to disrupt your faith? Would you allow it to push you away from God? Some do, some will. Some will abandon God. But Habakkuk just realizes this is how God's going to do it. And so I will do my part. He's going to silently pray. So following his prayer, point 2, Habakkuk begins to speak then of the coming of God. And it really is a beautiful picture. Even in its terror, there's great beauty here. And this is point 2, the advent of God, when God comes, in verses 3 through 15. I'm over in chapter 2. God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is a hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered, and the ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under the distress. The tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. Did the Lord rage against the rivers, or was your anger against the rivers? Or was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their place. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the horse of the house of the evil to lay him open from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They storm into it, scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. So he begins with this majestic, awe-inspiring picture of God. He tells of the glory of his coming in verses 3 through 4. The Holy One is coming. The pure one who hates sin, he's coming to deal with that. His presence covers the heavens with majestic glory. Purest light streams from him like the sunrise. This light is of such splendor it hides his power. The brilliance is like the garment that hides his glory. Remember in Exodus 33 when Moses wants to look at God and God puts him in the cleft of the rock and says, you can only see me after I pass by. You cannot look at me. You know, I find this interesting when you think about the idea that the sun hides his glory. A month or so ago, Teresa and I decided that, I told Teresa we should do this. We should get up in the morning and we should find a spot out where we live, and we live off of the 303, so there's a lot of empty space on the 303. Find a nice little spot where we can sit in the morning, get up really early, 4 o'clock, take our coffee, take like a little fiber bar or whatever, and sit there. I can't bring Count Chocolate with me. It's too messy. We're going to go sit out there, and we're going to watch the sunrise. So we went out there, got out early. We found this nice little spot. And I've been looking for a couple of weeks trying to find a spot every time I'd come back. We found a spot, and we sat out there, and then there was these mountains right in front of us, looking eastward. And the sun started coming up over that hill. And I was like, we should next time go look for a sunset. She's like, yeah. Have you ever watched the sunrise come over the mountains? And you stared at the sun the entire time, right? No, it's like bright. It's like, I can't look at it. I'm like, oh, this is really cool, but I can't even look at that. You can enjoy the colors because it's just, he's saying that in all of its glory is hiding the glory of God. And if you can't stare at that, you can't look at God. That's the glory he sees. He tells of God's majestic glory in verses 5 through 7. He says there is pestilence, slays any who dare to oppose him. I like the idea of this pause of battle. This pause of battle he brings in here. The idea that he stands there and these storms come in. And it's God's just standing there looking. As if everyone's looking at him and there's nothing they can do. That's his glory. He's coming to deal out wrath to those who oppose his righteousness. There's a lull before the storm, and then the enemies have to bow down before him because he's just too grand. In fact, Habakkuk says the mountains can't even stand before him. Get that in your mind. Our Colorado family here. I lived in Colorado for a number of years. I'm sure many of you have been to the mountains. I'm not talking the foothills of Texas, okay? I'm talking mountains here. Imagine the presence of God where the mountains just lay flat before him. They cannot even stand. Not because he stepped on them, but just because he was there. Just because his presence was there, they laid out flat. They crumbled at his majesty. God's glory is too much for man or matter. And so, even though Habakkuk is in fear, he still sees the glory and majesty of God and what's coming. And then in verses 8 through 15, he speaks of the purpose of God's coming. Certainly it is for the destruction of the enemies of his people, but it's also for the salvation of his people. God coming is not strictly to destroy the wicked. It's to destroy the wicked, to punish them, so that his people will be preserved. And that is the core message that we need to take from this. That is our hope. Because whatever nation you live in, whatever may come of that nation, if that nation begins to crumble, be it America, be it someplace over south, wherever, you can put your faith that God will preserve you. That doesn't mean that you will not go unharmed. It doesn't mean that you won't face affliction. It doesn't mean that at all. But if you're faithful to God, he remains faithful to you. And even if you face the gravest of trials, he will still deliver you, ultimately, in the end. So Habakkuk speaks of the purpose of God's coming. I want to share with you a couple of things in verses 8 through 9. Because I was reading through these, you might have been asking yourself, what's he talking about? Your bow was, verse 8 said, did the Lord rage against the rivers, or was your anger against the rivers, or was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, or your chariots of salvation, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. What Habakkuk is doing there is he's mentioning previous times that God did what he did for the salvation of his people. In verse 8, he's talking about the Red Sea. About the Red Sea parting. For what? The salvation of his people. In verse 9, he lets us know, though, that whatever salvation is going to come, it necessitates a fierce battle. Sometimes the salvation that brings that God brings about for his people requires a fierce battle. Look what happened to Egypt. Look what God had to do in order to save his people. He did what he did to save his people. He parted the Red Sea. In verse 10, he flooded the earth. He says, the mountain saw you and quaked, the downpour of water swept up, the deep uttered forth its voice. You remember when the flood came? The skies opened up and the deep opened up. He did all of that for what reason? The salvation of his people. You see, what Habakkuk is doing is he's reminding us that there have been times past when God has brought great destruction upon humanity for the sole purpose of saving his faithful. That's our hope. So he dealt with evil in the time of Noah by flooding the earth. He dealt with evil in the time of Moses as he destroyed Pharaoh's army. Verse 11, his wrath is so overpowering that the sun and the moon just simply stand still. And then verses 12 and 13. In indignation you marched through the earth, in anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You struck the head of the house of the evil. So the reason for this uproar is to save his people. This is God's avenging wrath. He's going after those who belong to the realm of the ungodly. You see, in Judah, you had these ungodly Jews. They were oppressing their own people. And in the process, leading people away from God. And the way that God has to deal with this, because they're not listening to him. They're not changing their ways. They're not saying, oh, we were wrong about this. We've actually seen where we're doing what's wrong against God. He left that up to them and gave them that opportunity to do that. He gave them an opportunity to do that when Israel was taken away into captivity. You think Judah would have woken up and said, hey, let's slow it down here just a little bit, guys. Look what happened to the 10 tribes. No. Oh, for a little while, they're stable. But it doesn't take long for them to go off either. And think about this. God is not looking for the preservation or the salvation of his people simply for that day. Simply for those people. I'm just going to save Judah for the sake of saving Judah. No. I'm going to save Judah for the sake of saving the world. Because you see, through Judah is going to come the anointed one. Through Judah is going to come the Christ. And so the remnant must be preserved. And he knows that humanity is not going to do that. They're destroying it. His own people are destroying his own people. And so he says, I'm bringing upon them this punishment. Not just so I can save them for that day, but so that through them will come the Messiah who will fulfill my promise to Abraham and bring salvation to the world. Hey, and if you got to suffer a little bit to bring salvation to the world, so be it. Right? If Judah, the righteous people in Judah got to suffer because of what the wicked people in Judah are doing, but their suffering is going to bring about the salvation of humanity, do it. You're a humble servant of God anyway. In verses 14 and 15, this army of wickedness will be destroyed by what they use. I like how he turns it around. He says, hey, they use these weapons to bring about their destruction of these people. Judah, the Chaldeans did. But listen what he says. You pierced with his own spears the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exultation was like those who devour the oppressed in secret. You trampled on the sea with your horses on the surge of many waters. So he says God turns around, and what he does is he brings them down by the same tools that they use to bring down his people. But here's one other thing to note here. Verse 15. You trampled on the sea with your horses on the surge of many waters. You see, what Habakkuk is telling us and telling these people is that God will go to great lengths to save his people. He will cross the ocean, so to speak. He will come from great distances to rescue his people from those who are oppressing them. He will put his horses on the surge of many waters. Storm will not stop him. The enemy won't stop him. He's going to save his people. He's got the power, the glory, the might to do it. So as Habakkuk looks to the Lord's coming, he is awestruck at the power and the majesty of the Lord. He realizes that God's coming has purpose. It will destroy the wicked and preserve the righteous. And then in verses 16 through 19, we have his conclusion. I heard, and my inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. Decay enters my bones, and in my peace I tremble. That's that Shagayanoth, that inner turmoil he's having, right? In my place I tremble. Because I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. Though the fig tree should blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He has made my feet like hinds' feet and makes me walk on my high places. So, in verse 16, Habakkuk ponders the things that have been revealed. And he then reveals the innermost depth of his soul, anguish. Anguish. You know, I think some people today are in anguish. I think some people are in anguish today as they look at this country and look at what's unfolding, different things that are happening in this country. In fear, concerned about what's going to happen, how's it going to affect the church, our freedoms, what's going to happen to those things, which way is this country going to go, and where are we going to be in all this mess? Habakkuk's looking at the destruction that's going to come upon him. And notice how he says this. My inward parts trembled. At the sound, my lips quivered. He is terrified. I mean, if you know anything about the Chaldeans, he's not going, hey, it's going to just be an all-block party. We're going to get together, chat a little bit, share some food. Now, we already saw how he described what they're going to do. And verses 17 through 18, even though the future will be bleak for them, he determines to rejoice in the deliverance from God. If you go back and look at what happens to Judah, how bad it gets. They were starving. They were starving to death in Jerusalem. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. You see, that's what I said earlier. Even if we get caught up in all this mess, and even if we suffer, that's what he's saying. We're not going to have any food. It's not going to produce. There's not going to be any hope of food. Well, we'll just wait till spring, and then when the fall harvest comes, no, They're not even producing. You're going to starve. You're going to start dividing your children and eating them. You're going to take the head of a donkey and boil it and eat whatever comes off of that. But he says, I'm going to exult. Why? Because no matter how bad it gets, the outcome is still salvation. The outcome is still salvation. I will rejoice, it says in verse 18, in the God of my salvation. So because Habakkuk is sure of his salvation, his strength is renewed. His feet no longer tremble. They are like hinds' feet, swift and sure. Let me tell you something about myself. There are times, and I've really tried hard to back away from this stuff. There have been times when I get caught up in reading all of this stuff, and I just get worked up. That's a good way to put it. Worked up. I go off on my little ranting tangents, and then poor Teresa just says, sit there and watch me. And I'm just like, ah! Do you know what always brings me back? The minute I focus myself back on God's plan and his salvation. It's an instantaneous peace. I mean, I go from to like, God is in charge. Just back off, you know. He'll be all right. He'll be all right. May not be what I want. May not be what I think should happen. But he's the God of my salvation. So as we consider Habakkuk's situation, we can understand what he's going through. We know, and look, some people look at this as being broader than just what he said about the salvation of his people and eventually Christ coming. Some have seen this as a pattern of how God works with nations. And ultimately, I can see that as a broader argument here. That God is going, because he's a God of righteousness, but also a God of judgment and justice and wrath, that God is going to protect the righteous, but he's going to condemn the unrighteous. Those who are ungodly will face punishment. But he will preserve those who seek to follow him. He loves us. His goal is for our salvation. He sent his son to die for us. And so he set in motion a plan to do that. But that doesn't mean that we live in a world that's going to accept that. In fact, the majority of the world rejects it. The vast majority of the world. You might say 99.999% reject it. There's a very small portion of this 6.5, 7 billion people that actually accept Christ. So God has his work, he has his plan. We accept what he offers us. We know he's going to deliver us, and whenever we allow ourselves to get worked up, and I think one of the hardest things is injustice. Injustice. I cannot tolerate injustice. There's something about it that just, maybe it's the way because I was brought up being very unjustly treated. And I see, when I see people just being treated bad, it just gets me some way. And when I see evil winning out, it really gets me some way. You know, you just like, why do you get to win? You need to go down. So trust in the God of my salvation. So in applying this to us, many believe that Habakkuk is laying that foundation for all ages to come. And ultimately, I guess the outcome is this: God will protect us. God will protect us. Take comfort, take peace in that. It doesn't mean that hardships won't come. It doesn't mean that, privileges and rights that we cherish won't be taken away from the country that we live in. You know? What it does mean is that no matter what happens, and as Habakkuk said, he didn't look at the situation as being very good for them. Even with the Chaldeans coming and doing what they were going to do, there wasn't going to be anything for them to eat. They were going to be facing starvation. It'd be a horrible situation. But he said, I'm going to trust in the God of my salvation. You know, I hope this is an awakening for us in America. A lot of things have come out this last year that I think has been profound for the church. What took place under this and what continues to take place with this COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of times things like this weed out those that are just simply pretenders in Christ. You know? And then with the politics that are going on, I hope that we learn something and that we grow from it and realize and refocus ourselves and remember who we are as God's people. Amen. Not who we are as a nation. I love America. I appreciate this country. I do. But just like those in Hebrews chapter 11, when I chose to put my faith in God, I left behind this country. That's what the Hebrew writer says. He says that they were looking for the country which they came out of, they could have went back. But they were looking for a heavenly country. And so they focused on that. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to do some things to make change. But I think we also need to realize that as Christians, we need to stay focused on who our King is. What kingdom we are actually a part of. And then as God deals with the wicked nations around us and the wickedness that takes place, that we simply serve him while he's doing it and let him do his work. But in the end, he is still the God of our salvation.